Welcome, everybody, to this session on UBI and reducing inequality. I'm Michael Howard, and I'll be moderating this session. We have 5 presentations, so I'm going to jump right into it and introduce our first speaker, who will be speaking on the topic Cash Transfer with Social Currency in Brazilian Cities, Poverty Relief or Guaranteed Income. Our speaker is Fernando Freitas, and I'll turn it over now to Fernando.
So, hello, I'm Fernando Freitas, a PhD student in economics at Universidade Federal Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro State, in Brazil. I'm also a member of Maricá Basic Income Evaluation, which is a mixed methods evaluation research formed by a partnership of my university, UFI, and the Jane Family Institute, a North American independent research institute. The paper I'm presenting today is part of my personal research, and I tell about the spread of cash transfers paid with digital social currency in Brazilian cities, which follows 2 models: poverty relief and guaranteed income. So, on the summary, first I will tell about Maricá experience with creating their so-called citizens' basic income paid with digital currency. Then I will speak about how this model is being spread. This dissemination is mainly in the 2 models, as I said previously, guaranteed income and poverty relief. I will show challenges of both and then gather up some conclusions. So, firstly, presenting Maricá. Maricá is a Brazilian city in Rio de Janeiro State with 165,000 inhabitants. It created Mumbuca digital currency with minimum income programs in 2013. In 2019, all cash transfers were merged into a unified program called Citizens Basic Income for 42,500 people, which is 26% of the population. The current value is 200 Mumbucas per person, which is approximately $40 per person. And each Mumbuca values R$1, which is the national currency. So this policy does not create money from zero. Every Mumbuca that exists has a parity with R$1 that exists in the city budgets. But I guess the first question that shows up is Maricá really a basic income? So here I'm using the criteria that is shown on Van Parijs and Van der Bot's book on 2017. So there are a few checks that the policy does, and ones that's not exactly, and ones that's definitely not. But let me show you briefly. Yeah, it does pay monthly, 200 Mumbucas per person. It pays a uniform value per person, and it is unconditional. So you don't have any behavioral counterparts. If you're eligible, then it's everything. You can have other complementary other revenues, like you can receive the basic income and other social programs from the local or federal governments, and you can access every public service either. And if it's paying cash, it's yes and no, because it's paid in Mumbucas, the local currency, which offers freedom to spend within the city borders in whatever is necessary. But beneficiaries can't convert into reais and spend in other cities. Is it individual? Well, not exactly, because it is paid individually, but it can be spent through only one card per family, or through an applicative through the cell phone. Is it an adequate value? Well, again, not exactly, because 200 per person you would need six people in a family to receive the minimum salary here in Brazil. So it's not a bad value, but it's not great either. And it's definitely not universal because it covers 26% of Maricá population, not in the entire population. But the Maricá basic income, citizens' basic income, is framed locally as development strategy. So this basic income and other social policies are paid in mumbucas, which they can be only spent only in the city, and the circulation of this currency, which has a small tax per transaction, 2%, funds an interest-free microcredits offered by the Mumbuca Development Bank, which is a bank in the city. These steps reinforce themselves, like spending only in the city is the key for the economic development in the city and funding for the programs and microcredits. So it's basically like that. People receive, people spend, and every funds, everything that is spent remain the city and keeps circulating the city, generating developments and growth. And also in each transaction, there is a small tax that goes through the funds and can be reinvested through microcredits. So here I brought a small graphic that's in a paper that's I made with a few colleagues. And at least in the short term, we found out that Maricá policies are able to improve the formal jobs creation. We found this out with econometrics using synthetic control technique. It was especially relevant starting the pandemic, the jobs creation, when basic income value was increased and the city created other policies paying the mumbucas. So here you can see that this technique shows that it basically shows Maricá compared to others comparable municipalities in size and budgets and population. So at the jobs creation Maricá, it like goes very high compared to other municipalities, starting mainly during the pandemic. So the end keeps going high. It is in a French book, in a French text, unfortunately. So these positive preliminary results with jobs have made a few positive outcomes. So in 2021, 3 other cities in Rio de Janeiro state followed Maricá model: Niterói, Itaboraí, and Cabo Frio. And at least 5 other cities created similar policy during this year. So here I brought a few comparative of the aspects of each policy in these municipalities. So Niterói is a similar policy compared to Maricá, but Itaboraí and Cabo Frio are very different. So in Niterói, it's basically the same thing. It pays monthly. It's unconditional. You don't have any behavioral counterparts. You just have to be eligible and you receive. You can complement other revenues, but there's the uniform value. It's a little bit different than Maricá experience because there's a minimum of 250 reais, which is $50 per family, and a plus of 90 reais per person. So it's if one person exists in a family, it's 250 and just 90 more per each person. So it's not an uniform value anymore. The same thing. It's paying in a local currency, the Araribóia. Beneficiaries can spend whatever they want, but they can convert to reais and spend in other cities. It's individual, but there's the same limitation that there's only one card that you can expend the money that you receive through this policy. It's not a very high value, considering there is just 250 per family and 90 per person, and there's a limit of 700 reais. So it's a little bit more than half our minimum wage. So it's a good value, but it's not a living wage for a family. And it's definitely not universal because it covers only 11% of their population. And Itaboré and Cabo Frio, they're different because as I will show in these characteristics, they have a little bit characteristics of a poverty relief. So they are paid monthly. It's and that's okay. It's a uniform value, but there's a difference because it's a fixed value per family in both cities. So it doesn't matter the size of the family. So it's a little bit bad, which I consider very bad because the same value for each family, it's not fair. But the good thing is you can complement other revenues from other social programs. As I said, that it's not an adequate value because it's just 150 and 200 per family in the cities, which is a little bit around $40 per family per month, so it's not good. And it has the same limitations of being paid in the local currency that can't be converted. But in these two cities, Itaboré and Cabo Frio, you can only spend in a few goods. So mainly foods and medicines, this kind of things. And so you're not free to choose in this case if you receive the money. Well, it's not individual since it's paid for family. It's not universal because it covers only people in poverty and extreme poverty. And it's definitely not unconditional because both they are very strict on their eligibility checkup because they focus mainly on poverty and extreme poverty. So proceeding, these two models of cash transfers with social currency. Maricá and Niterói follow the same model of guaranteed income model with a broader development strategy with a high percentage of the population covered and also offers microcredit policies. But at the same time, Itaboré and Cabo Frio, they follow a poverty relief model with a strict criteria for eligibility, a low coverage on the population, and there's no broader aim for development. It's mainly a poverty relief program. So this model, since there are two submodels of cash transfers with social currency, which I see Maricá and Niterói, they have the main challenge remains the effectiveness of these microcredit policies and how to make the most efficient uses of these resources to promote growth and development. On the other side, on poverty relief submodel, there are high costs of implementation, especially to know who's eligible and who's not due to restrictions and the focalization. And in this model, with a small number of people using the currency, the main challenge is to make the capillarity of the currency happening. So to sum up my presentations, there are two main common aspects. All these four cities have cash transfers paid with digital local currencies, and there are no conditionalities. So it's a model of cash transfers with this digital social currency in these 4 cities that has no conditionalities. The divergences about these cities is that the target public of each program, so Maricá is the brother, and Niterói follows, and Itaboraí and Cabo Frio, which is follows the poverty relief model, it's mainly focus on extreme poverty and poverty. Each model has its challenges, but has its merits too, especially Maricá that has shown these improvements in the formal job creation. The guaranteed income model still needs to improve microcredits in their local development strategy. And in the poverty relief model, there are high management and monitoring costs and low capillarity of the currency. So that's all my part. Thank you.
Fernando, if people in the audience have questions, please type them in the chat, and we will have time for some question and answer at the end of our presentations. So I'm going to turn now to the next presentation, which will be by Julia Eep and Sai Annem on Miracle Money, Tackling Relational Poverty by Coupling Social Support with Basic Income.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sai, and my team member is Julia. We will be presenting on a follow-up study to a combined basic income and social support pilot program called Miracle Money. So to start off our presentation, we would like to give a little bit of background on Miracle Messages, the nonprofit from which the Miracle Money program sprung. We find storytelling to be a key part of our work, and so we have a special video we want to share to set the tone for our presentation. From then on, we'll get into the specifics of the Miracle Money program and our study, and are happy to take questions at the end of the section.
It's unpacking day for Elizabeth Softkey. She's sifting through memories that were tucked away for 2 years while she was living in a shelter.
In my wildest, ugliest dreams, I never imagined ever that I would be in that situation. My life before it fell apart was full of wonderful opportunities and activities.
Softkey, a mother to 3 grown children, taught elementary school for 10 years and ran her own educational nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area. That world abruptly collapsed in 2018 in the wake of an advanced cancer diagnosis.
The surgery happened very quickly, and I thought, okay, great, I'm done. But a few weeks in, my oncologist decided that she wanted me to go on a super aggressive chemo regime. I was also not allowed to return to work. My immune system was so compromised, and that meant digging into my savings to pay rent. And then when I ran out of money, I was evicted from my home of 14 years. I was looking at the reality of nowhere to go, except for sleeping out like at a bus stop.
Eventually, Softkey moved to one of many hotels in California, offering temporary housing to the homeless during the pandemic. She was safe, but the journey back to her old self seemed impossible, or so she thought.
She was a volunteer for Miracle Messages, and they had started a new program because of people being housed in hotels and the struggles they were facing of isolation.
It became evident that even though people were now sheltered safely, they were alone.
And so, Joan Scott offered Softkey a lifeline. As one of the many Miracle Messages volunteers, Scott routinely checked in with her and promised to be there for what they hoped was her journey out of homelessness.
We hit it off basically right away.
She's brilliant. Elizabeth is a perfect example of breaking that stereotype of what some people think of people who are homeless.
She's a UCLA graduate, nonprofit executive, former journalist. The image of who is homeless in the United States is a mirage.
Sociologist Kevin Adler has made it his life's calling to help the unhoused. 7 years ago, he founded Miracle Messages, the nonprofit responsible for bringing Softkey and Scott together.
Our vision is that no one goes through homelessness alone.
Do you have anyone either you'd want to reconnect with or how?
Yeah, I do want to reconnect with my family. I don't know where any of them are.
We'll find them.
Okay. Thank you.
Adler gives the unhoused a connection, either with a new friend or by reuniting them with family.
Just to check in, just to talk to.
250 volunteers work making phone calls, writing letters, doing digital searches to locate loved ones, deliver messages, reconnect people with their families.
But he wanted to do something more.
And so we launched one of the first basic income pilots for people experiencing homelessness in the country called Miracle Money.
The unconditional cash payments, known as Universal Basic Income, or UBI, have been tested in many cities, but the homeless have largely been left out of the picture. As a result, last year, Adler launched a GoFundMe campaign to finance his own UBI.
We set a goal of $15,000. We ended up raising about $40,000 within a day or two on Facebook.
He would eventually raise $50,000, and with that money,
we distributed $500 a month for 6 months to 14 individuals experiencing homelessness.
I was speechless. At the time, I wasn't working. I was getting my basic needs met, but I didn't have an income.
But just how could an extra $500 a month change things? The median price for a house in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the pilot was launched, is just over $1 million.
We had zero expectation that anyone was going to get housed. Elizabeth was eligible for senior housing. She just needed to have some income to pay a contribution to the monthly dues.
I just wanted to get back into the normal world. Without the Miracle Messages money program, I would not be living in this home right now.
And I saw how immediately it just took a huge burden off of her and enabled her to plan for her future, to save money.
Softkey isn't the only one the program is helping.
We had 2 individuals get service dogs that they needed for their PTSD. One individual who bought a blender because he can't eat solid foods. If it was just us telling people what to do, we wouldn't have used the money as well as they used the money for themselves and their families. And we were shocked and amazed and inspired by the fact that 50% of our unhoused recipients were able to secure housing. There's Ray, who was able to save up enough to be able to find a housemate and contribute to half of the month's rent. Carrie Dad, who had a $302 a month contribution to her single room occupancy.
And then there was Drake Alabanza, who was no longer able to work his job as a nurse after he developed severe sciatica and began living on the streets. Miracle Money helped him afford an SRO unit, single room occupancy.
It's hard to describe because when I think of that, all I can think of is a miracle.
Today,
All right. So, as mentioned in the clip, Miracle Messages is a national nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, USA. We offer 3 services, which include Miracle Messages, the reunion service, Miracle Friends, the phone buddy system, and Miracle Money, our basic income and social support pilot. The inspiration for Miracle Money came from observing the importance of a social support system and the possibility that combining basic income and social support would be more effective together than pursuing each alone.
Right, so to give a brief program overview of what Miracle Money is, it's a novel basic income pilot that combining cash transfers with social support for people experiencing homelessness. A Bay Area pilot was launched in early 2021. It was a 6-month pilot, and we gave $500 a month to 14 recipients, and 13 completed the entire study. And they also had to enroll in our one-on-one buddy system called Miracle Friends, where they were matched with a volunteer for weekly phone calls and texts. And that was the social support component. On the left here, you can see the list of outcomes that we measured. And we did this through a baseline semi-structured interview with monthly phone surveys and an offboarding phone interview. And then for the follow-up study, we conducted 13 interviews with the recipients as a 6-month follow-up. And then we compared data from the 3 interview time points, so baseline, at the end of the cash transfers, and also at the end of the 6 months follow-up period, and then use qualitative theme analysis and descriptive statistics to analyze the data.
In our follow-up study, there were 3 main themes that emerged during data analysis specifically related to basic income. Participants reported having greater agency over their money, they felt decreased stress, and were able to prioritize their savings. We pulled out some of our favorite quotes from the interviews to highlight these themes that you can see on the slide here. In addition, an unexpected success of the pilot was that 66% of participants who were unhoused at the start of the pilot secured independent housing by our follow-up study. In regards to the social support component of the pilot through the phone buddy system Miracle Friends, there were 4 major trends that we pulled out. Having the Miracle Friend throughout the process aided in participants gaining new trust in the world, facilitating social connection with others, improved their mental health, and most people found social support more important than money. In fact, 85% of our recipients cited improved social connections with their family, community, and Miracle Friends volunteers.
All right, so we do recognize that there were some limitations to our study, the first including an inaccuracy of translation. So 2 of the recipients needed a translator to help complete the surveys. Due to time and resource constraints, we didn't use professional translators, and so there may have been some inaccurate communication. There's also a lack of a control group. So since we didn't have a control group, we couldn't test for statistical significance or draw any causal conclusions. We actually did start this pilot with a control group of 8 unhoused friends who were nominated but not selected to be in the treatment group. But as months went on, participation dwindled to the point where we really only had 1 recipient complete all the surveys. And we also just didn't have the resources to keep up with other recipients. So we just decided to leave out the analysis of the control group. But that's definitely something that we recommend for future studies. There's also a small sample size and missing data points. So having a small sample size of 13 allowed us to dive deeper into recipients' responses and get their stories. But this also meant that our results are not as generalizable. In addition, some recipients skipped a few surveys because their phone was stolen, broken, or lost, or we just couldn't reach them. And lastly, we did have to use self-report data since we didn't have the capacity to track behavior. However, in future pilots, we definitely want to work harder and try more to capture that behavior rather than just using self-report data. And some of our key takeaways. So basic income combined with social support has synergistic effects on social connectedness for people experiencing homelessness. Even a small amount of money can help with housing stability and also help people experiencing homelessness save. Social support is at least as impactful, if not more impactful, than basic income in the long term. And all this being said, we would love it if we could do more research exploring the combination of both. And we definitely think that we want to see more basic income programs also implement a social support component because we do believe it is understudied and really, really important and necessary. And that leads us to what's coming up next. So we're really happy to announce that we're actually conducting a 110-person Bay Area RCT very soon. So we're actually right in the process of starting to give out the first monthly payments. And we're excited to see what the results from that will be. So this has now turned into a much larger pilot. All right. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Both. And our next speaker will be Aleida Baumgartner, speaking on the impact of an unconditional basic income on income inequality in the United States. I'll turn it over to Aleida.
Hey everybody. Let me see if I can access my actual slide deck here. Here we go. I'll just go through to the next one. I believe it should be after this. All right, otherwise I can just go ahead and speak on my own presentation without my slides. But essentially my work involved, I completed, oh, there we go, perfect, awesome. All right, so I worked on completing a literature review regarding the impact of a potential UBI on income inequality in the United States. I wrote this as a final paper for income distribution class that I took at NYU as part of my economics master's that I'm doing there right now. Essentially, just to situate my own work, when we're studying UBI, there's kind of two approaches that we can take, at least from an econ perspective, which is the one that I'm taking. You can be someone who's working in the implementation side, who's conducting UBI pilots in the field and collecting research on how those pilots are impacting the well-being of individuals who are participating in those studies. And typically what we see with those studies is that individuals who receive UBI benefits or essentially cash transfers see huge increases in their well-being and their finances and their social, or their ability to take part in social life, and a lot of reduce in their own stress. But we want to make sure that that kind of opportunity is available to everybody, which is kind of the idea behind a universal basic income, is that it is universal and we can make sure it's accessible to all. But in order to make that possible, we need to understand what the effects of such a policy would be at the national level, because that's where we ideally would want something like this to be implemented. So my work addresses more the national side and the macro issues. Before I jump in, I'll just use some definitions that I addressed in my paper, which is my definition for UBI and UBI adjacent policies. I use the definition of UBI that is universal, or essentially an unconditional basic income. A key way that we model that in econ is using a lump sum grant to all individuals, which is unconditional, universal, and basic, which essentially means that it can cover people's basic expenses like their food and housing. Of course, not all policies that we see as UBI that are actual UBI pilots can account for all of these elements, since it's a little bit of a hefty ask. So I also refer to UBI adjacent policies, which are usually unconditional, but typically not universal, since we don't have necessarily an actual UBI in place right now in the United States. A common UBI adjacent policy that you can see is an NIT, or a negative income tax, which is essentially if you are somebody who falls below some kind of income threshold, typically the poverty line, then you can get some kind of subsidy, and you can use this to approximate the effects of an unconditional cash transfer, or essentially to approximate a UBI. Another common UBI adjacent policy that you'll see is the EITC, or Earned Income Tax Credit, which is essentially, it's basically like an NIT, but it's a wage subsidy. So if you make a certain amount, then that amount could be added on top of by the government with some kind of rebate or tax rebate. Okay, so essentially my paper was looking into, firstly, the theoretical impacts of how we as economists might model what would happen if we actually implemented a universal unconditional basic income on the population of the United States. Like, what would happen to inflation? What would happen to unemployment? All of those big indicators that we care about. But that theoretical literature also needs to be balanced by what we've seen in the field through UBI pilots. And specifically what we're caring about with experimental literature is what's going to happen if we suddenly make it possible for people to opt out of the workforce without having to worry about their basic needs. Would that mean that we suddenly see a huge drop in the labor market? Would that mean that the UBI would no longer be able to sustain itself because people would end up leaving the workforce more than the UBI could end up making sure that they could keep track of all their basic expenses? So I'll address the theoretical to some degree, although it's a little bit more boring, and I think people are more interested in the experimental side. So essentially, I'll start there. On the theoretical literature side, we have these two major branches. There's basically a bunch of tax models that we can do, and then a bunch of microsimulation models that we can do. Some basic tax modeling would basically include a combination of a potential flat tax and a lump sum redistribution. So that could model a UBI, and then we see what happens to a very common measurement of inequality, which is the Gini index. The other way you would do this is we can basically develop a mini model of the economy using a bunch of really fancy computers, and then see what happens to a bunch of important indicators in the economy, like also inequality and the Gini index and other things we care about, like inflation, basically the whole output of the economy, which would be GDP, and that would be the microsimulation approach. So instead of going through all of this, which I think would be a bit boring, I can just kind of summarize the main tax model approaches. For Merrill, Rothman, and Barnes, who are like one of the main contributors to this part of the literature, they essentially find that targeted redistribution would be better than a classic or untargeted UBI for reducing income inequality, which, think about it, makes a little sense, because when you take a bunch of money that you've collected using just a flat tax and then you throw it back at everybody at the same amount, it might be a little bit less effective at helping the people who are at the bottom of the distribution than taking the majority of that money and returning it to people at the bottom of the distribution. And we kind of see this repeated throughout all of our overall tax models. I'll just skip through most of this because I think I'll focus more on the experimental side this time around. And essentially what we find from theoretical results for the impacts that they predict for a UBI that would take place in the United States for reducing income inequality is that those results would be mixed. We find that a lot of these models are incredibly reliant on the labor supply the labor supply elasticities that they have input into the underlying workings of the microsimulations. So for those of you who are less aware of economic literature, labor supply elasticity essentially makes us answers the question of what's going to happen if we give people a bunch of money and they previously had jobs. Will they stay in the labor force, or will they leave the labor force in order to pursue other activities, which we would call leisure in econ, but other people would call other life activities like taking care of children, going back to school? Would they replace labor with some other kind of activity? And that's really important, because if we see a lot of people leaving the labor force, then the UBI, which we would expect would be built on the collection of tax from the general population, its base for tax collection would shrink and shrink until it might no longer be able to sustain itself. So we need experimental literature to determine how individuals who receive these kinds of cash transfers that are unconditional would react to receiving a continued and expected cash transfer over time. So a great way to measure what would happen, or to get an idea of what might happen if we instituted a national level UBI, is to look at the literature that covers lotteries and labor supply, because essentially what happens when you're a winner in a lottery, right, is you've received an unexpected cash transfer, and we can measure whether or not you stay in the labor force, or if you decide to leave the labor force when you've been given this unexpected cash transfer. Of course, it's not a perfect representation for what would happen under a UBI, where ideally you would be expecting the cash transfer over a long period of time and it would be permanent. But it gives us a good idea of how individuals of different backgrounds and demographics might react to receiving a UBI in the future. We also have some experiments that were conducted in the 1960s and 70s in the US and Canada, and these are the income maintenance experiments, or the IMEs, where the US and Canadian governments attempted to institute some pilots with negative income tax, which is one of our UBI adjacent policies, and they got a lot of interesting results that are still being analyzed to this day. We also have another example, which is pretty common in this field, is the Alaska Permanent Fund. And then lastly, we have some other national level policies, which are important to reference since we are concerned about a national level policy in a developed country. So let's see if I end up with enough time to cover this. But under lotteries and labor supply, we have some pretty interesting literature, and one piece of literature is that by Cesarini et al., which studies the effect of winning a lottery on labor supply using a randomized experiment of monetary prizes in a large sample of Swedish lottery players. So over here, what happens in general, or something interesting that this paper addresses, is that in Sweden, you can take advantage of the fact that there are some bank accounts which utilize a lottery element in order to incentivize people to increase their savings. So a PLS here, which you can see, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that word, but essentially a winner account is a type of savings account where some of the interest payment on bank deposits or marketing dollars are distributed as chance prizes. So what they do is they can collect data on individuals who receive these chance prizes and see how they respond to or see how they react to receiving that money. Do they leave the workforce or do they remain in it? And do women leave more or do men leave more, et cetera, that type of thing. And there are different types of these lotteries that they use to incentivize savings within bank accounts. It's a pretty cool system. Essentially, what they find is that winning a lottery prize moderately reduces your labor earnings and individuals end up working fewer hours. Well, this is not too crazy. Kind of makes sense that if you make some money unexpectedly, you might reduce some of your hours, at least temporarily. Reduction is immediate, persistent, but interestingly here, they find that it's similar by age, education, and sex. Commonly, a lot of studies find that when women receive unexpected sources of cash transfers or other kinds of income, they tend to leave the labor force a little bit more, and that's because they tend to carry our childbearing or child-caring needs for society a little bit more than men do, even still today in developed countries. We also find that pre-tax earnings decrease by about 1% of the wealth shock in each of the first 10 years following the win. This does align with some other literature, but again, it does also slightly disagree with other literature regarding sex differences in receiving cash benefits. But it is important for addressing UBI policies, especially because this takes place in a developed country. But an important thing to note is that this is checking on labor supply effects that were from an unexpected income shock. A UBI would involve an expected income shock. So we might expect that somebody who knew they were receiving an extra $500 a month might not change their willingness to work in the labor force as readily as somebody who suddenly received, like, I don't know, $5,000. That might be a little bit of a different reaction. So another famous example of an experimental version of UBI would be the US and Canadian income maintenance experiments. I'll focus more on the US side because my paper is more oriented towards income inequality in the United States. But essentially, we had basically back in the 60s and 70s, there was an NIT on labor supply and other variables like poverty, health, and nutrition in the late 60s and 70s. And this work, among other work on lotteries, addresses labor supply concerns over potential unearned income hikes in a developed country in the US. So there were 4 different experiments. There's one that took place in Jersey, another in North Carolina, another in Indiana, and Seattle and Denver. And essentially, there's a bunch of kind of mixed findings for these. Originally, people who worked on addressing these findings had some conclusions about labor that kind of aren't super supported anymore. They found that there were a reasonable amount of labor disincentives. So people left the workforce. They also found some impacts on divorce rates, which were incredibly unexpected and may have led to this not becoming a national policy, but you could look more into that on your own time. More recent evaluations have been inconclusive, but in general, there is still some support that UBI might have a negative impact on employment rates. I'll go ahead and skip the Canadian one for now. But, this one is kind of important here. Essentially, we see that young and single-head households drove work withdrawals, which is also a little bit stronger of a result than they found for the US ones. So essentially, the impact you could be asking for income inequality here would be that the result of direct cash transfers in each of these experiments could result in reductions in income inequality, since essentially by providing everybody with some kind of reliable cash transfer over an extended period of time, people can end up moving up the income ladder, especially in a local community if you measure that directly. But in general, most of these weren't super focused on addressing income inequality per se. They were more worried about addressing labor supply itself when they were coming up with these experiments. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done in addressing exactly how labor supply withdrawals could directly affect income inequality if a UBI were to take place nationally. And then we have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is also has a lot of very cool studies, which I have covered in my paper, and you can certainly read more about all of these on your own time. But essentially what these find is, at least for Kosminski and Bayek, they find that long and short run coefficients are positive for all three types of income inequality. So this is one of the unique papers that actually found that the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is an example of a reliable source of cash transfer for individuals who live in Alaska, increased income inequality to some extent. So if you're interested in this, I'd recommend reading more about this paper. And before I overrun my time too much, there are a few versions of UBI adjacent policies which have been instituted at the national level. There's one in Iran, which did find a reduction in income inequality. However, of course, Iran typically has very high levels of unemployment, so take that with a grain of salt. And then lastly, we have this discussion in conclusion. Essentially here, my point is that while there's a lot of great research right now being done on experiments in UBI and the potential effect of a UBI on labor supply, there's a lot more research that we need to do on how an actual UBI would affect labor supply in a developed country, because that's probably going to vary very differently than it would occur in a developing country where perhaps it wouldn't have as much of a strong effect on reducing labor supply. So there's more research that needs to be done in that field. And in general, there's a lot more basic income policies which need to be investigated in the United States and Western Europe. But other than that, there's plenty more that people have to say about this on this panel. So thank you for your time, and happy to field any questions y'all may have.
Very much, Aleida. Our next speaker is Jan Stroeken. He sent us a pre-recorded video on basic income from redistribution, ideology to work as life fulfillment and socio-cultural revolution, and what this means for the implementation strategy. And Jan, do you want me to run that video, or do you want to start it yourself? Thanks.
You have to run it, Mike. I can't do that from here.
I will find it here in the queue. Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jan Stroeken, Dutch economist, retired at the moment, and in the past working for the universities in Nijmegen and Eindhoven, and later in the research institute TNO in Holland. In 1986, I wrote my thesis about basic income. And well, as we all know, the discussion about basic income is very old, about a century. In this presentation, I first want to give you a personal view on the discussion of the last decennia, but the emphasis will be on the main arguments that will be important for the discussion in the short time and the longer time. Details and reference you will find in the paper I made for this Congress. Now, let us have a look at the first sheet. You see it now there. My memory goes back to the early 80s, when I was writing my dissertation. And there I emphasized 3 topics. First, the main argument for the introduction of basic income is based on the efforts of many generations before us. As a result, even in these turbulent times, with the climate crisis, the pandemic and the war, the claim for redistribution via a basic income remains intact. 2. The hope for a happier world with another view on work at that time was not that important. And 3, when introducing a basic income, do it through a negative income tax, because the gross net process is much smaller than with other options. Okay, the next sheet will come now. And when I consider the discussions of the last decennia, I see a focus on financeability and labor market effects. As regards financeability, we always have to realize that basically this is not a fundamental problem. It isn't a matter of cost, but a redistribution of income, and of course you will save a lot of money by decreasing social security benefits. As regards labor market effects, at one side traditional models predict a slight decrease in supply, at the other side countless basic income experiments are not negative, they are neutral or positive. Nevertheless, for all lower incomes up to the average, the current incentive to work more is not or hardly present due to the existing poverty trap. The complicated system of income-related schemes, allowances, deductions and tax credits is to blame for that. Reducing the poverty trap due to a non-conditional basic income then seems to lead to an increase rather than a decrease in the labor supply. About these 2 topics, financing and labor market, the following. These are usually traditional objections from opponents who often have never really thought about basic income themselves. Proposals for another implementation method or funding source have little effect on convincing these kind of people. And so this discussion distracts from the real discussion. And now I come to my main point. What is important in the future, in the real future discussion? 3 things. Increasing importance of income redistribution, the changing view of work, and the social cultural revolution. We are going to have a look at these 3 topics. First, income redistribution. There will be an increasing need for protection of lower incomes. Why? There will be first a growing group of flexible workers. This has to do with technological possibilities like internet and the mobile phone, but especially also cultural developments such as the desire among young people for more freedom of choice and autonomy. There is also a strong desire to combine care and work. More and more people are working part-time or as self-employed. This growing group of flexible workers will always be faced with uncertainty about future income, pension, what happens in the event of illness, and incapacity for work, accrual of holidays, etc. A basic income is as basic security would bring the growing group of flex workers back into the middle class. Second, the problem of the increasing individualization. In more developed countries such as the Netherlands, there is an increasing number of people with an independent income. The uniform breadwinner household from the 50s no longer exists. The increase in diversity of the family composition caused by individualization leads to big differences in the average income per individual. The individually paid basic income provides a solution because it reinforces individualization. And the last point, but not the least, the climate crisis. The pricing of pollution by taxing all kind of pollution provides the greatest incentive to make reductions to both businesses and consumers. So that will have more and more influence in future. It is clear that the lower incomes cannot afford this. The solution is to use these revenues from taxes for financing a basic income. The hope for a happier world with another view on work is getting stronger mainly by the younger generation. For now I only want to emphasize a recent Dutch study of labor market professor Paul de Beer about how people look at their work. And there are two important conclusions. 1. 2 out of 3 people find enjoyable job content and pleasant people to work with very important. And second, work you are proud of and room to show initiative also score higher than the salary. And now, what I think is the main topic, namely the coming socio-cultural revolution. In recent literature, we find more and more indications for a socio-cultural revolution. Dutch professor of transition science Jan Rotmans expresses this in a fantastic way. He says, we live in a change of era in which everything that is taken for granted is being questioned. We need no fewer than 10 major transitions in the fields of energy, raw materials, circularity, agriculture and food, space, finance, education, healthcare, society and democracy. It's about a considerable change with a fundamentally different way of thinking, acting and organizing. This initially leads to chaos and unrest, which is necessary to move forward in the transition. This chaos must therefore be embraced. It leads us further. On the basis of these 10 transitions, Rotmans describes a future vision, the Netherlands in 2121, and naturally includes the basic income as a component. According to Rotmans, it provides the necessary social peace and security. Authors like Harari, Sandel and also Varoufakis give also indications for this socio-cultural change. You will find summaries of their work in my paper. As argued here, the current and future discussion about basic income should mainly focus on the increasing importance of income redistribution, the changing view of work, and partly linked to that, the socio-cultural revolution that awaits us. It's important to focus on that. That new world will include a different way of thinking, acting and organizing, and whereby the human being is central. The first steps are observable. Active citizenship through the now many local cooperatives like the care cooperative, the food and the energy cooperatives are examples of this. These are also examples of a desire for local democracy, because the old vertical model of politics no longer works. Personalized wishes are also observable in the labor market, as evidenced by the changing labor market wishes of young people. To finish, the last sheet. The question: how can we strengthen the arguments for basic income in future? And the answer: the main discussion and the main research has to be: how does the introduction of basic income relate to all the coming different transitions and the arrival of a different society? Thank you very much.
Might be on mute.
On for that. And our next speaker is Tracy Smith-Carrier, who will be speaking on the topic, are the UN SDGs a valuable platform for advancing basic income? So take it away, Tracy.
I'm not going to go through my agenda. It's there if you need to take a look at it. Just want to say that I am calling in today from the traditional lands of the Kwasepsum and Lekwungen peoples. And this land acknowledgement is one small step I can take to recognize the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous people endure in Canada and abroad. And I accept responsibility to help reveal and correct these injustices. All right, so important to set the stage or the context for the presentation. Decades of development. Before we get to the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to talk about what happened in the past. In 1951, the UN commissioned a study to examine the measures for economic development for underdeveloped countries. The 1960s was the first development decade, and it was the intention behind it was to tackle unemployment, underemployment in countries of the global south through increases to productivity, technology, and economic growth. The second development decade, in the 1970s, was comparable to the first, but more extensive. It affirmed the accelerated macroeconomic growth targets in the achievement of well-being and happiness, not only for the present generation, but for generations to come. The 1980s, we saw the third development decade. It reiterated the demand for a new international economic order with an explicit call for poverty eradication and the regulation of transnational corporations. Arguably, the 1980s was the most aggressive of the development decades. It's interesting to note that this was the most aggressive development decade in the 1980s, at the same time that the fundamentalist neoliberal market ideology took hold globally. In 1990s, we saw the fourth development decade. It sought again to eradicate poverty, hunger, adult illiteracy, and redress the lack of education for women. For the first time, we also included objectives related to promoting sustainable and environmentally sound practices. So as noted throughout these decades, the economic growth imperative was not the direct machination of the 1980s neoliberal era. It is and always has been the defining feature of development. So after the fourth development decade, in the 2000s rather, we had the Millennium Development Goals. Ban Ki-moon noted that the MDGs helped to lift more than 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, to make inroads against hunger, to enable more girls to attend school than ever before, and to protect our planet. All right, it's important to note when we're talking about poverty eradication about the international poverty line. So Martin Revillion was an Australian economist at the World Bank, noticed that the poverty lines of some of the world's poorest countries in the world clustered around $1 a day. So he advised the bank that they adopt $1 a day as the first international poverty line, based on the 15 poorest countries in the world. Of course, in 2005, the international poverty line was rebased to $1.25. And then in 2015, it was rebased yet again to $1.90 to adjust for the depreciation and purchasing power of the dollar. What happened then with the MDGs? We're assuming here that there were mass reductions in poverty, right? Well, that depends on your measure and who you ask. Oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself here. The Secretary General of the UN unveiled the 2012 MDGs report, saying what the most significant message was: the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has been halved ahead of the 2015 schedule. So 3 years before the slated end of the MDGs, we had basically eliminated poverty for half the world. In reality, closer inspection reveals that the UN's claims about poverty and hunger were misleading and actually intentionally inaccurate. So depending on your starting point, extreme poverty was actually on the rise. The alleged triumph of MDG 1, which was about poverty, was overestimated. And people like Jason Heichel have argued that $1.25 a day is not sufficient to guarantee basic nutrition or provide children a fair chance of survival. Next, oh, that's kind of funky. Sorry about the slide. After the MDGs, we ushered in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2030 Agenda was supposed to be a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and into the future. It encompasses 17 Sustainable Development Goals that include an urgent call of action for all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. So we're supposed to have strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, spur economic growth. It's important to mention that, all the while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. So now we're getting onto the good stuff with the SDGs and basic income. The problem, first I have to ask this: has poverty been reproduced by UN specialized agencies in countries of the global south? I recognize that there are multiple levels of the UN, but one level specifically includes international financial institutions, IFIs, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Structural adjustment policies. I love the acronym here, SAPS. It's such a great acronym for the phenomenon. The World Bank and the IMF imposed structural adjustment policies on countries of the global south after the oil crisis in the 1970s and the subsequent stagflation in the economy, and after, as we've noted, years and decades of development. These international financial institutions would give loans to countries needing assistance, but with huge strings attached. They must adhere to structural adjustment imperatives in order to receive that money. Oh, so what did they have to do? They had to reduce their deficits through currency devaluation. They had to deregulate their business practices, privatize their publicly owned entities, have austerity budgets, or reduce their funding for health and education and social expenditures. They had to promote free trade, and of course, rigid conditionality had to be on loans. What happened with these loans? extreme poverty around the world, which of course led to the poverty reduction strategy papers. Basically, same agenda, different packaging, what my colleagues and I have labeled policy recycling. So in the 2000s, the World Bank and the IMF came under fire for their structural adjustment policies. They moved towards country-owned poverty reduction strategy papers, what some suggest are pernicious country-owned directives that sought to give the international financial institutions their legitimacy. Via these poverty reduction strategy papers, the World Bank and the IMF extolled the conditional cash transfer model to alleviate poverty, while disciplining individual neoliberal subjects refusing to comply. Central to the structural adjustment policies sorry, I'm just moving on here. World Bank. The World Bank says there's good evidence that conditional cash transfers have improved the lives of poor people. Transfers generally have been well targeted to poor households, have raised consumption levels, and have reduced poverty by a substantial amount in some countries. In light of the extreme deprivation fostered under the structural adjustment policies in countries of the global south, the preferred approach was actually then to provide a modicum of stability or safety net through conditional cash transfer programs. Ruckert argues that the conditional cash transfer program became popular to deepen the hegemony of neoliberal architecture and to monitor the expected behaviors of neoliberal subjects in exchange for survival through income support. So, are we gradually moving to a universal basic income? The World Bank Group has said that the UBI is defined as a transfer that is provided universally, unconditionally, and in cash, and it holds an attractive promise to change across many lines. And the UN Kanye-Wiganara argued that the UBI should be part of the stimulus packages to provide stability during COVID-19. But they should not only be temporary, but they should be a permanent feature moving forward. So, are the UN SDGs a valuable platform for calling for a basic income? Sure. We must note, though, the SDGs are entirely aspirational. They don't impose any required or sustained actions on political actors. Therefore, they're often disregarded or not taken seriously. There's no expectation that human rights, social and economic, or climate will be embedded into domestic laws and policies. In Canada, we're not on target to meet our SDG commitments, and research confirms that this is the case elsewhere too. In fact, UN Chief Antonio Guterres has said that we're tremendously off track to meet the SDGs. Yet the SDGs are one of the only frameworks we have that have international currency and salience and seek to hold state actors accountable. So it could be one that we could use to argue for more adequate unconditional cash transfer programs. As noted, there are a few countries around the world that have embedded human rights domestically. There are a few different models. In the US, international treaties must be ratified by Congress after a treaty has been signed by a member of the executive branch. This is probably why the US has been loath to sign treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But in other countries, once a treaty is ratified, it actually is fully enforceable in domestic law under the general transformation model. So France, the Netherlands, and Germany have that model, although there are problems even within that model. Canada and the UK have a special transformation model that applies. So we require specific domestic legislation in order to bring international treaties into our domestic law. So what ends up happening, obviously, is that we end up ratifying these treaties, but don't actually enact our international obligations. So going back to the question about whether or not the SDGs are a valuable platform, Kohler finds that the SDGs are not ambitious and they lack a systematic policy approach. And yet, they could be used creatively and subversively to move towards greater climate and social justice. So Kohler suggests that we inject radical thinking and action into our economic, environmental, and social justice aims. And yet the author concedes that whether this could succeed in light of the political constellations is open and requires an idealistic faith in the power of ideas. So getting to the conclusion, it's uncertain that the aims of the UN SDGs will be met by 2030. Like every decade of development before, we had to have another decade. We had another decade because we never could meet our obligations. Most likely, we will not meet our SDG obligations by 2030. The UN specialized agencies of the World Bank and the IMF have misinterpreted, misrepresented, and provided misinformation in the past to downplay their role in the restructuring of the Global South and also the findings of development programs. Advocates and researchers can use the SDGs as a platform for calling for a basic income, among other frameworks. They provide an anchor to ground claims and a mechanism to hold politicians accountable, hopefully without strings attached. The domestic implementation of international rights law, it would appear around the globe, is one of organized hypocrisy. We should seek to advance a platform of human rights, but these rights should be substantive, they should be real, and not just aspirational ideals. Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to the discussion.
Tracy, and we now have about 15 minutes for questions. I see that there are 3 questions submitted by Stephen Stillwell. Since nobody else has submitted any, let me just take the first 2 of those, which I think are somewhat related. He says, have you considered the inevitable effects of including each human being on the planet equally in a globally standard process of money creation? And how is the fiat money anything other than an option to purchase human labors and property? That's all anyone does with it. Trade with other humans for their stuff conveniently without arranging a barter exchange. We won't get paid our option fees, earned basic income. So that's, I don't think directed to anybody in particular. Would anybody like to respond to those first 2 questions? Not hearing any response, let me just read the 3rd question, and this I think is directed specifically to Tracy. Can you suggest how all SDGs won't be achieved or fully enabled by including each human being on the planet equally in a globally standard process of money creation? In other words, it's related to his other questions. If people were receiving their fair share of the value of money creation, instead of that all being monopolized by the banks, I'm kind of paraphrasing here what I understand in the question, would including people equally in the globally standard process of money creation enable us to reach the SDGs?
That's a good question, and I hadn't really considered it before. I think most people around the world are just trying to survive, and so if we had a basic income, I think that would free up people to actually engage in more protest and other things to make our world a better place. But that then assumes that we'd have to have the basic income to do that. So to do the protest. So I think it's kind of the opposite order of what we need to do. In terms of trying to have, assuming that everybody's an individual and is equal, I think it's important to note in these models that there are people who are not more that are more powerful in making the changes. And so research on climate change, for example, shows that we can basically distill down to about 100 corporations that have done, 70% of the emissions come from like 100 corporations. So I know we like to talk about equality and everybody does their part. That's part of the problem, I think, is it assumes that there are no power dynamics at work. And so we have to get at the power dynamics and really call those actors into account that have more power in order to make substantive changes. I'm not sure if I responded well to the question, though. My apologies if I misunderstood.
See, did anybody else want to respond to this topic? Okay, I don't see other questions in the chat, but this might be an opportunity, since you've all heard each other's presentations, if you have questions for each other. We've got 3 presentations that are looking at sort of detailed empirical studies and modeling, and 2 sort of big picture presentations that relating basic income to UN SDGs and the questions that we ought to frame if we want to advance basic income in relationship to changing ideology of work, redistribution, and social and cultural revolution in Jan's talk. So if there might be some questions connecting those 2 different levels of analysis. Does anybody want to jump in with a question for one or more of the other panelists? Well, let me throw out a question. This is perhaps in some ways a minor point, but on the question of the relationship of basic income to the labor supply, Aleida, citing a lot of the empirical work over the last few decades, said there's a slight decrease in labor supply. And as we know, that's provoked a lot of debate. Some people see any decrease in labor supply as a problem. Others see it as an example of the success of basic income. Jan has, if I understood correctly, argued that there's no decrease in labor supply. In fact, maybe it's the opposite, that basic income has increased labor supply. So there's possibly a disagreement there. I wondered if Aleida or Jan, you would want to speak to that question a bit further. I'll give Aleida the first chance to respond on that and then turn to Jan.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to address that. Let me make sure that I'm connected. Can you hear me right now? Yes, I'm going to go with yes.
Video.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about my video, but can you hear me though?
It's coming through loud and clear.
Okay, I'll just stick with the voice. I've been trying to figure out my video, but it's a little bit busted. Yeah, so I mean, from an empirical perspective, labor supply is kind of a tricky question because it depends a lot on the context that you're studying it in, and B, also it depends on what kind of cash transfer you're delivering to somebody, and also in what country they're located. So there's a lot of variation in how you can deliver a cash transfer. You can give it to men, you can give it to women, you can give it to young people, you can give it to old people. And all of those different demographic groups have huge variations in how they're going to A, work in the labor force prior to a cash transfer, and B, after. So a lot of UBI pilots need to work on, I mean, they're already doing a really good job of this and we need more of that. But the specific groups that they're targeting their interventions to are going to have vastly different responses in their labor supply. So when we look at these aggregates of labor supply, how do people respond to getting cash transfers? It's kind of a misnomer, and it can be a misleading thought, since a lot of different people, depending on who they are, will react really differently. If you're a single mom who has 3 kids and suddenly you receive an additional income of $500 a month and you know it's going to come in for the next year, then you'll probably cut back on your hours if you're working an hourly job because you have a lot more responsibilities at home. But if you're perhaps a father of those 3 children and your family receives an additional income and you've been wanting to move up into a different position that could provide you with more opportunities, now you can perceive that as an extra opportunity to get more hours. So it really depends on which group we're targeting an intervention to at the empirical level. And it also, a big part of this question is, which countries are we working in? Because in a developed country, it's a lot easier for somebody to take time off of work because we have a lot of other opportunities outside of work for us to pursue. We can rejoin an educational institution. We have a lot of opportunities to work in like our communities and do other stuff that doesn't involve work. But in a developing country, that can be a little bit different, since typically people in developing countries are earning significantly less than an individual would be who is in a developed country like the United States or Western Europe. So in a developing country, you'd see a much larger increase in labor supply, since people are now getting way more benefit for the amount of hours that they work compared to what they would be getting in the United States or in Western Europe or another country like that. So yeah, the question of labor supply is a tricky one, and that's kind of the reason why it has a lot of contention surrounding it. But in general, at least my recommendation is just continuing to work on these UBI pilots, because really the only way we can get a better idea of how a country at the aggregate would respond to a nationalized level of UBI, which is what I'm interested in, is to get really good data on how these specific groups would respond to a sudden increase in a long-term expected increase in their income compared to what they had before. So yeah, our pilots are really the key thing that we need to work on. But yeah, I don't know, Yelena, I'm sure you have some other perspective on that as well, which I'd love to hear about.
Did you want to jump in?
Definitely. How do we switch camera? No. How can I get in?
We're hearing you just fine. Just continue. Jan, are you there? Jan seems to be maybe having some problems with the audio, but there is a question from the audience. So let me read that. How do we make basic income a share in stock exchange worldwide? $1 share, the rendite is symbolic, reducing extreme poverty and safe society from conflicts or civil war. I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, but I think it's a question about how we could design a worldwide basic income to reduce extreme poverty. So would anybody like to tackle that question? Please feel free just to jump in if you have anything to offer. Okay, hearing no response on that question, Tracy has posed a question. Do you think that the research might be mixed on the negative income tax experiments because the imperative of conditionality is so strong? The assumption being that conditionality must be present for a basic income to be successful. I'm not sure that conditionality is necessary. It is an instrument to shape people's behavior, taking an individual explanation of poverty rather than a systemic one. I think that's probably directed to perhaps to Aleida. So
there was the follow-up one too, which was my understanding from the negative income tax experiments is that actually for primary earners, the hours of work went up. It was the reduction in secondary and tertiary earners that went down. So essentially, it was the fact that mothers wanted to stay home with kids or with their babies longer, and that children were spending more time going to school rather than going into the workplace. There's actually the same results that we found in the Minkum experiment. Evelyn Forget found in Minkum in Manitoba.
Aleida, did you want to comment on that as well?
I think I'd have to reiterate exactly what we just heard. Yeah, that's correct. Essentially, we find typically that it is like women or secondary or tertiary earners who tend to leave the labor force more often when they're offered cash transfers. So that's exactly what would happen. Yep, completely agree.
Those who've been working on the pilots, Julia and Sai, did you have anything you wanted to add from the perspective of the work you've been doing?
Nothing in particular. I think I agree with also what Aleida has been saying.
And Fernando, did you want to shed any light from the work you've been doing in Brazil?
Would be quite useful in this case.
Can I actually address the one that came up earlier in terms of the stock market, leaving basic income to the stock market? For me, it's very much the state are like the only ones that actually have human rights obligations to ensure that they're providing for basic needs. So I think the onus should be on the state who, collects taxes and is responsible for wealth redistribution. I have a big hesitancy to rely on the stock market or to rely on the market itself to provide basic income, given that so much of what we're seeing in terms of the issues with capitalism, to rely on it again to provide basic income for me I just can't see it. I'd be very wary of it.
We are just a little bit over our time. Before we close, we're allowed to go a little bit over on this particular panel. So I just wanted to see if anybody on the panel wanted to add anything to our discussion before we close. All right, hearing no further comments, I want to thank all of our panelists for a very stimulating discussion, and many of these topics will be taken up in some other sessions later in the conference. Thank you all for attending, and wish you well for the rest of the conference.